Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, Swami Satchidananda Saraswati, Swami Nityananda, Yogi Bhajan, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. These are all names of notable individuals in the world of cultic studies and education. One thing they each have in common is supposed enlightenment. Another thing they also have in common are allegations of sexual abuse, harassment, and exploitation. Typically, gurus speak of purity and celibacy, yet commit acts of horrific sexual violence. Some preach sexual freedom and expression, yet commit acts of extreme sexual violence. However, these men have spread the rhetoric and teachings that seem to always have another agenda afoot. And the list of names, I'm sure you know, is much more extensive than this. Hello listeners, and welcome to this bonus episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and for this lengthy conversation I am joined by author Mary Garden. I must start this episode with a trigger warning within our conversations of a very sensitive theme, including sexual abuse and more, so please proceed with caution and listen with discretion. This episode was particularly difficult, and because of this, and the breaks that I took from working after our conversation, I have decided to release this episode in its entirety. Mary is a wonderful author with a compelling voice. Her storytelling is second to none. If this episode is too difficult for some to listen to, I would recommend grabbing yourselves a copy of Mary's book, The Serpent Rising, and reading what you are comfortable with. It is a very powerful memoir. I will also post links in the episode description. But for now, here is Mary Garden. So hello Mary, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today to talk about your experiences and your published books, including a memoir titled The Serpent Rising, A Journey of Spiritual Seduction. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on your brilliant show. And my name is Mary Garden, and I am 73 years old this year. And I now live in regional Victoria in Australia, near my daughter and my two beautiful granddaughters. I grew up in New Zealand.
I heard that there's been some earthquakes over in New Zealand. Have you heard about this on the news?
Is that just recently? They've had terrible storm. They've had the storm weather in Auckland, which has been quite incredible. Yeah, the weather events in New Zealand, I'm sort of looking over there because they usually look over here in horror at all our bushfires and flooding. But what's happened in areas that I once lived in, like especially in Auckland, I was there for 3 years, and then in Nelson, where my half-sister lives, it's just horrifying. My goodness. The world is in a very shaky place, I feel.
I do feel that way as well. I don't remember, and on the news, there were reports of potential life-threatening tsunamis as a result of some of the conditions over in New Zealand at the moment. So I reached out to my friend Adam Dudding, who is the podcast co-creator and host of the show The Commune, which is based on Centrepoint. And I asked him if he was okay because we've got these breaking news articles coming through about potential life-threatening tsunamis over in New Zealand. I sent him a quick email and I said, "Hey, Adam, are you okay?" And he was like, "I had no idea any of this was happening until you emailed me." And I've looked it up, and the coverage in New Zealand is pretty minimal and kind of like, yeah, it's not anything to worry about. It's happening in places that really not many people live in. But over here, it was like, oh my goodness, awful things are happening over in New Zealand. But I thought that was interesting because it's my understanding that you know a little bit about Centrepoint.
Look, I've been working on a book for the last 2 months, and I'm really going into much more detail of our family life in the 1950s and 60s, because this was the part of the last book that I wrote after Serpent Rising on my pioneer aviator father. It was the 2 chapters which looked at the intergenerational trauma and growing up in New Zealand. That's the bit everybody loved. And I ended up having to cut about 10,000 words from there. The editor said it was going into a new book. So I've been digging into that part of my life. I've actually just finished the first draft. I've been working like a maniac. And I ended up in Auckland. It's a long, convoluted journey to get there, but I was in Auckland in 1972. So I was turning 22 that year. And it was the most difficult year in my life. You know, I had all that trauma that happened in India and in my childhood and even as an adult. But that year in Auckland, back in the 1960s and 70s, there was actually no mental health condition. Depression was not recognized. There was only by manic depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety. But I was suffering now, looking back, really bad depression. And I had cut myself off from my friends. I had no idea what was happening with me. I wasn't religious then. I had turned my back on Christianity, but I thought it was the devil. That was the only explanation I could have with what was happening in my brain. And we grew up in an era in New Zealand, our greatest fear was being carted off to the loony bin and getting electric shock treatment or lobotomy. And that almost happened to the famous author Janet Frame. She only escaped a lobotomy because one of her books won a prize. And even as a child, that was the fear we grew up with. We did not talk about how we felt. So here I am in Auckland, back at university, doing a master's degree, so depressed, and, you know, accompanying depression always comes loneliness, cut off from all my friends, and there was no mention of therapy or help groups. But around Auckland University, there were flyers advertising Bert Potter's courses. And I was so wanting to do them, but I was too nervous. So it's quite incredible. But I ended up years later, when I came back from New Zealand in 1976, I actually did one of his courses, and I've written an article on my experience that weekend with Bert Potter. And yeah, I was rejected by Bert Potter because I was a Rajneesh sannyas and he didn't want anything to do with me. And I thought I was the only woman in the group who he didn't take downstairs and have sex with or whatever he did. But there you go. It was, I could have easily joined that group. And you've got to remember, back in those early 1970s, there were no warnings about groups or cults. It was just this, the Beatles had gone to India, to Mahesh Yogi, and many of us were disillusioned with the counterculture revolution and the hippies and the drugs. You know, there was a gap in our lives. Yoga was quite new. I had been doing yoga at university, and we all turned eastward. It was just such an exciting time. So, you know, at the end of that year, I dropped out of university, burnt my thesis, and by chance went out to this little yoga ashram in the outskirts of Auckland. It definitely wasn't a cult. I just wished I'd stayed there. But there was this little wooden ashram run by this eccentric yoga teacher, Lou Postlethwaite. And it was I think there were 5 people living there at the time. And it was really one of the happiest times in my life, because for 4 months I'm living, I felt it was the very first time I'd felt at home. I was with this group of people. I turned vegetarian. We were chanting and meditating at night. It was quite a heady time, and I was reading all these books, The Search in Secret India and Siddhartha, and I thought it was quite incredible. I thought all these things had been going on behind my back. It was like I'd been living in the bottom story of this 2-storied building, and suddenly I'm up in the upper story thinking I had no idea this was going on. And I'd become religious. I thought I am going to become enlightened. I'd become converted to Hinduism. It was just an astonishing time. And my depression had vanished.
When you took
We've
this,
leapt right ahead here, haven't we?
yeah, no, I love it. I do. I think that it's kind of like nice foreshadowing of all of the things that tie together your experiences. And I always go back to this one term that author Esther Friedman once told me in an interview, is she calls her cult experience a misadventure. So your spiritual journey is like many different things that come together to create this really like wild experience that you had in all of these different places and all these different flavors of India that come through in your book. I felt like I could feel the heat and I could taste the food and I could hear the sounds. It was really quite an experience reading The Serpent Rising. And jumping ahead a little bit, I think is okay, because it gives the listeners a little bit of insight into what we're going to be talking about today. But I just wanted to ask you quickly about firstly, thank goodness, but Potter wasn't interested in you at his session. Oh my goodness, thank goodness. Also, what were your reactions later on, finding out what was actually happening at Centrepoint, a place that you could have ended up living in? Just for everybody listening, Bert Potter was the leader and founder of Centrepoint, which was, for all kind of intents and purposes, an intentional community which turned quite rapidly into a destructive cult with raging child sexual abuse and drug misuse and coercive control of just all types.
Well, look, it was the same reaction I felt after hearing about what had really gone on at Pune with the Rajneesh ashram, because he went to Pune. His Centrepoint commune was almost an extension of Pune. And I only have a little bit in my book on my times with Rajneesh, and I didn't know a lot of what was going on. Some of the stuff that did go on that I accepted at the time, I would never accept now. But look, to be perfectly honest, I had a fantastic time in Pune compared to what I had suffered up in the Himalayas with this psychopathic yogi. So I didn't want to write that. I knew my book needed to focus on what had happened to me in that little isolated ashram up in Rishikesh. And a lot of people were disappointed that I hadn't written more about Rajneesh. But it sort of didn't surprise me about Bert Potter, because there were so many groups that turned into this. And at the beginning, when I wrote The Serpent Rising, I mean, it was right back in 1988. And I was incredibly ambivalent when I began writing it. I mean, a part of me wanted to go back to India with my children, because I thought I've missed out. It was my bad karma. I need to find the right guru. But in fact, it was through writing the book that I realized, oh my God, what did I get caught up in? And I mean, this is the real power of writing memoir and your stories. And I'm finding this with the book I'm working now. It not only gives you insight into things you've experienced, I believe it can actually heal your brain.
Wow.
Which sounds quite extreme, but that is my experience. And I wrote The Serpent Rising and self-published it. I gave up trying to find a home for it, and then felt like, oh my God, am I the only one in the world talking about what's really going on in these groups in India? At the time, when my book was finished, Hugh Milne's book was released called The God That Failed. But it wasn't for another 10 years that these stories came out. And for a long time, I felt quite ashamed that I had actually written this book. There must be something wrong with me. No one else is writing about this stuff. I even burnt and mulched for my garden most of that first print run, because I thought, what have I done? I felt guilty for speaking out. And then all these stories came out, and I was encouraged to do a new edition, and I was vindicated. A new book came out in 2003, and by that time I had done quite a lot of therapy and had psychological help, and just thought, no, it was a very important book that's actually had helped a lot of people.
Absolutely. And there are still stories coming out today, and still things being learned about different swamis and yogis and supposed enlightened beings that were very revered and followed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and still are today.
I
There
know.
are still stories coming out all the time.
It's
And
incredible, because I thought, there were no exposés when I went over there. And I thought, once I wrote my book and there was Hugh Milnes and then all these books started to be written, I thought, oh, no one will go on these trips again. But they do. It's actually mushroomed. I mean, New Zealand is seems to be the centre of intentional communities. And it just goes to show that it is nothing to do with intelligence or rationality. People have a need to belong to a group and to feel at home. And many people may not agree with me, but for my personal story and my experience, it all goes back to our childhood and the culture we were living in. It definitely was for me.
Sorry, it's almost like I'm speaking to a pioneer of exposés on exploitative gurus in India, because there were many, there still are, and I am really looking forward to exploring some of those people with you today, because there were a number of figures explored in your book that I haven't spoken about on this show at length. So for me to learn about your story, and the back end of the book having a smaller focus on Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was actually, I think, beneficial, because it's in keeping with your story, but it also allows us to understand the coercive control taking place with other supposed enlightened people in that part of the world. So as the listeners have probably worked out by this point, we're not talking about a group that someone has been born and raised in. We're talking about an experience that you have after embarking on a solo journey. So before we get to that point in your timeline where you decide to go to visit India, can you talk us through what your early life was like, the culture of the times, and what it was like to grow up in your home and in New Zealand as well?
Oh, terrific. So I was born in 1950, and there is this tendency to look back on the golden years on the 1950s and 60s, but in the book I'm writing, I'm saying they are not so golden. There was a lot of family violence going on behind hidden doors. I grew up in I won't even call it dysfunctional, and a very dysfunctional family. And I wrote about this in Sundown of the Skies, the story of my father, who was a pioneer. He was a pioneer aviator in the 1930s. So he had been a famous pilot in the 1930s. He was one of the few aviators who had survived. And he ended up at the head of Tasman Empire Airways, which became Air New Zealand, and resigned with a huge chip on his shoulder, which I won't go into, which my mother said he took out on us, and married my mother in 1947 and became a tomato grower. So he eventually settled in Tauranga, which is a beautiful place in New Zealand on the east coast, Bay of Plenty. So he was home all the time. He was very authoritarian, very controlling. He was born in the very far north of Scotland in Tongue, and was exposed to one of the, I'm trying to think what it was called, Free Wee Wees, the most Calvinistic Presbyterian church, and that had a huge influence on him. So he was very authoritarian, had this violent streak, was very miserly. He had a gambling addiction. He was never touched us, never touched Mum after Anna was born. That was it, you know, single beds. So we grew up in this little nuclear family, and I knew very on, many children don't, but I knew very on that there was something wrong with my family. And we were not like other families. I had a huge amount of embarrassment and shame about it, because we would go off down to the South Island at Christmas to escape from Dad, and there was Mum's family. It was like going from hell to heaven, and here was a normal family, relatively normal, where people talked and laughed, and there, you know, I didn't feel frightened there. I wasn't running away, hiding under beds, or running down the bank, or hiding under bushes. I was not living in fear down there. So I knew as a young girl, there is something wrong with this family. And this is very interesting, because my father also moved a lot, which was hugely embarrassing for me. I don't know why I would be embarrassed by it, because I was even embarrassed as a young mother in Brisbane when my mother would ring up and say they were moving again. He used to move constantly, and it was almost like he was on the run from his past, or he was trying to outrun his depression, outrun all his trauma from his early life in Scotland, which I explored in my book, The Sundown of the Skies. And but for a brief period when I was growing up, we only moved several times, and one property was on 3 acres, and we had the beach at the end of the acreage, and I used to go down the bank. There were hardly any white people there, and there were Maori fishermen there and Maori people. Now, that had a huge influence on me as a little girl, and I was also very dark. People used to say, "You sure you haven't got Maori in you?" I had, you know, black eyes and dark brown hair. I would go down on the beach and hang around these Maoris, and the Maori fishermen would teach me how to spear flounder. And all I had was this wish to have been a Maori, that I wanted to be, you know, they seemed freer than us, even white people in general. They were very communal. They were very friendly. And I grew up from the time till I left New Zealand when I was almost 23. I just revered the Maori people. I even taught them in 1 year before I went to Auckland University. So that's very interesting, that I had this need to join a group, communal group like the Maori. So that was a huge, huge impression on me. So it was my mother was also incredibly depressed, and the family was quite divided. It was sort of us against Dad. So Mum was very protective of us. She didn't really stand up for us, and I interviewed her at length for my book, and, you know, she said he was a bastard of a husband and a bastard of a father. He might have flown planes to perfection and grew tomatoes to perfection, but he completely failed as a father. And she felt that she had no choice to stay with him. You've got to remember, in the 1950s, there were no domestic violence services. There was no parenting allowance. She was trapped, and he was very, very controlling. I was not aware even though he was violent to my brother and I, not my sister, he would lash out for, even when we hadn't done anything wrong. I think I got a hiding once for accidentally breaking a glass when I went outside to get a glass of water, and I'd actually cut my wrist, and I had to go and get my wrist stitched up. So I got a hiding for that. But until after Dad died and I was researching my book, Mum actually told me that he had been physically violent to her, choking her. She had to have some of her thyroid removed. And I was mortified. I thought at least Dad wasn't violent, but of course he was violent psychologically and financially. So I, as a child, and also I grew up with this younger sister who very early on, we knew that she had a problem. And Mum had spent some years as a psychiatric nurse up in Carrington Hospital in Auckland, and she knew how they treated the mentally ill. Their greatest fear was that Anna would be admitted to a mental hospital, so they did everything in their power not to get her the help she needed. So I grew up in this little family nuclear unit with Dad at the centre, terrorising us. I had to be the good little girl, look after Anna, be someone that Mum and Dad never had to worry about, be like a little housekeeper. Like when Mum went away once with Anna, I was left at 8 years old to be like the little mother figure. And so I learned, and Anna used to have these outbursts of rage. And in the second house we lived in when I was little, the house was only a 2-bedroom house, and there was a little hut about 100 yards away from the house. It was an old wooden little hut, and my sister and I had to virtually live there and just come to the house for our meals. And Anna used to attack me, like in the night, even when I was asleep. She would scratch me and bite me, and if Dad heard us screaming out, he would run down, and it would always be my fault. What have you done to upset Anna? So that pattern was repeated for decades through my life, that if anything happened, if someone hurt me, if someone abused me, if the guru hurt me, it was my fault. That was deeply internalized. So you look at all the photos of me as a child, and I'm there with a big smile on my face, my sister's scowling, my mother's frowning. I was just this happy little girl, very pretty. People used to compare Anna and I and saying, "Oh, isn't Mary beautiful?" Very damaging what the adults did. So in this book that I'm writing now, I'm actually looking at the society that created a lot of this sibling abuse and the dysfunctional family that stood by and enabled it. And my only aim as a little girl was to grow up as quickly as I could and leave home. So, I mean, I've got photos of me when I'm 13, and, I really do think like I'm 25. I've got, I started sneaking out at night when I was 13. I would come home in the middle of the night. I'd be going off to parties and stuff, and all Mum would say was, don't let your father catch you. So it was a very unhealthy, dysfunctional family. You can say all you like that parents do the best they can with what they've got, but they were incompetent parents, and I did not get the protection I needed. There was a year at high school when Mum shunted my sister and I up to boarding school for a year in Auckland, my last year of high school. And my sister literally stabbed me in the back with what's called a compass. It's got this long needle thing about 3 inches long, and it went into my back, and only my sister was at home, and she just lay under the bed, and I was up telling her to call an ambulance because I had blood pouring down my school blazer. and I stumbled over the road to a neighbour who took me into the hospital to get it, and it had just missed my spinal cord. Now, I was blamed for that. What have you done to upset Anna? So look, I had all the patterns there to be a perfect recruit for joining a cult in so many ways. And look, for many years, even till my fourth year of university, I seemed happy. I had lots of friends. I was doing well. I had a boyfriend, but it was like my past gradually caught up with me. So by the time I was 22, and also at that time, I'm still looking after my sister. She would ring me occasionally, always threatening to kill herself. So I was always, despite the fact that she caused so much damage, I was still there worried about her. She would ring me when I was at university, threatening suicide. So I had all this mounting up on me, and I didn't tell anyone, and my mother didn't want to know anything that was happening with me. It was like, if only my sister could be more like me, we don't have to worry about Mary. So no matter what happened to me, it was like, Prince Harry talks about being the spare in his book. I felt I was the nothing. And even when I was little, when my brother accidentally broke my leg, he cut in front of me when I was riding a bike, and Dad wouldn't take me to a doctor for 2 days. I'm just jumping around on my leg. And Mum was down in Westport with Anna. When she heard, it was like, oh, no, I can't deal with this. So I thought, oh, great, I've got a broken leg and plaster. I'm going to get some sympathy. And it was like I learned very early on that I needed to be very independent, self-reliant, look after myself. I don't want Mum and Dad to worry about me. They're not going to worry about me. And I just want to grow up as quickly as I can, find my perfect man, get married, have babies. But, it's not as easy as that. And that, I was definitely, the trauma from my childhood caught up with me in that last year at university. It was just the most harrowing time because I didn't know what was happening with me. And I had started doing yoga when I was at Waikato University. So miraculously, I ended up graduating with a degree. I got a Bachelor's of Education degree and a teacher's diploma. And I got sick of going to parties. I got sick of getting drunk and taking drugs. And yoga came to Hamilton, and I started going, look, I just went there all the time. I loved it. I wasn't interested in the religious aspects. I just was very flexible, and I was very good at it. I'd show off, and it was a Iyengar yoga class, and I just loved it. But that still wasn't enough to ward off my depression and my anxiety. And I think that I left university and went teaching for 1 year and didn't cope at all, and went back to university to do my master's. And towards the end of that year, I saw a notice on the window of a health food shop about this ceremony at this yoga ashram in Henderson. And I wasn't interested in religion at all, but I just was curious. So I went out to that ashram that night, and there was, I think, the very first Hindu Swami to visit New Zealand. And I remember sitting at the back of the room, listening to the mantras, listening to the playing instruments. And I had the most extraordinary experience. It was like I felt, I describe it in my book. It's like, I felt transported. I can't remember what words to describe it, but absolutely ecstatic. I could not believe what was happening to me. It was just, I guess it's, that's what a lot of chanting and stuff, it's not all bad. And I thought, I drove home that night and thought, I'm leaving university. So I burnt my thesis and moved into the ashram. And it was fantastic for a while until I met this doctor who had just and my whole life changed. You know, I gave away most of my possessions, became a vegetarian. I was so happy. I had this group of people around me, felt like a family. There was this yoga teacher at the head of this ashram. He was part of the Shivananda ashram group, which headquarters is in Rishikesh. But he was lovely and eccentric. It was just such a beautiful time in my life. And then I met this doctor who had come back from seeing Sai Baba in Bangalore, who I'd never heard of. And I'm sure this isn't an exaggeration. I think there were millions of devotees. Is that correct? The minister of Prime Minister of India was a devotee of Sai Baba. He was down in Puttaparthi near Bangalore in India, and he was considered a god. And I heard all these stories about what Sai Baba had done and healing people, bringing people back from the dead. And I thought, this is the reason that my life has completely changed. You know, I've met God. It was actually Sai Baba behind all these changes in my life. So I started making plans to head off to India and got rid of most of my possessions. Bizarrely enough, you know, I go back home to say goodbye to Mum and Dad. Mum wasn't worried at all. Here I am, strange white little robe with sandalwood beads. Because I grew up with Mum saying, you know, whatever you do, don't end up like me. Whatever you do, don't get trapped like me. And the only person who was worried was, I had an older half-sister, Margareta, who was 10 years older than me. That was from my father's first marriage. And she's married to a very famous poet, author in New Zealand, Morris G. And I was very close to Margareta. She would come and stay in the Christmas holidays for a few years. And I kept in touch with her and wrote letters to Margareta from the age of about 7. I even rang her yesterday to tell her about my sister who's not well. And luckily, Margareta kept all these letters, because I wished I'd had those letters when I wrote The Serpent Rising, actually. But she was a librarian for a while and she kept everything. But I found a letter last week where she said she could not believe how, I've forgotten the word she used about my mother, not blasé, that she could not believe that my mother was not worried. And she was. Margareta was worried. She thought, this does not sound right what Mary's doing. And she, you know, she was worried about me. But Mum, even Dad, it was like bizarre. Here is this daughter who's got rid of all her possessions, a car. She's only got a backpack left. And she's taking off to India, and she actually has become a different person. There was no concern at all, which is very bizarre, isn't it?
You've mentioned that your search or your inner longing for some sense of community or belonging was within you from quite a young age. You were able to recognize that, whether it was going to visit your mum's side of the family where you felt freer and safe, and loved, or whether it was down with the Maori community that you were able to kind of, or become a part of when you would visit that part of your property. And I think that's quite telling for a young person to recognize that. One of the things that I did in my previous job was work with young carers, kids that look after somebody else in the home. And these would be kids aged 6 to 18. And there was a lot of parentification. So there was a lot of kids raising kids. There was a lot of brothers and sisters and children expected to look after and raise other children. And in the younger children, you would hear them say, "Oh, it's my favorite thing in the world is to look after my sister." And then I worked with the same kids for a number of years, and gradually you would recognize the change in thought processes, feelings, the responsibility and the resentment would start to rise as the individual got older and wanted to find out who they were, what interests they had, and what friendship groups they wanted to be a part of, and what activities they wanted to take part in that were separate to that caring role that they had. And I think that firstly, it's not recognized anywhere near enough in the world that it should be. And secondly, if you have that parentification role, you've mentioned you still, despite the difficulties in the relationship with your sister, would drop everything to go and support her if she needed you. On top of everything that relationship comes with, you've got the lack of affection from your parents, the lack of interest in you as an individual from your parents. There's no nurturing of a parent-child relationship from the actual parents. But then you've also got this religious aspect coming from your father that you're not really interested in. What you explore in the book, which I thought was quite interesting, is that you're just not really interested in Christianity. You actually renounce your Christianity, I think, in front of your father at like the age of 15.
No, much younger than that, about 13. I renounced them for Elvis and the Beatles. Fell in love with Elvis. Had photos of him plastered on the ceiling.
There's so many things, as you said, you were almost ripe for the picking in terms of recruitment into a destructive group. But there were so many different elements happening with family dynamics that just the parentification role on its own can be enough to leave someone searching for a place where they are taken care of, a place
Yes,
where their interests are put first, a place
yeah.
where somebody says, "What do you want to do today, Mary?" So I just wanted to take a second to offer, because I don't have lived experience in a cult myself, but what I can offer is insight into things like parentification from my previous job roles. So I just wanted to put that out there and hope that that might offer some validation to some of the listeners that have grown up in those types of environments, because it's resentment that grows and grows and lasts a lifetime, as you've explored. And of course, before we hit record, you mentioned that depression wasn't a recognized thing. The reaction to mental illness was electrolysis and lobotomies and all sorts of horrific horror movie things. So it's a difficult one, because then when you were suffering from the effects of someone suffering from the effects of mental illness, it's kind of it's almost, it's not like it's not like the cycle of abuse that's continued. It's like the cycle of mental health that's continued, because it was not dealt with.
Yeah.
Because I don't, dealt with's not the right word, because it wasn't recognized and supported in your sister in the way that it should have been. But and maybe even then it would have exacerbated things because of the state of mental health support in that time. It's so tough to say, isn't
Oh,
it?
look, I've been thinking of that lately too, because I've always had this resentment that mum and dad didn't do anything. I think they had a responsibility to stand up to her physical violence, which continued even when I was an adult. Like even when I was 54, she assaulted me. But I can now appreciate, because the headmaster had pleaded with them, please go and get some help for Anna. She needed to see a psychiatrist when she was very little. And Mum took her off for a holiday. That was the time when I broke my leg. The other thing, I became very close to my mother when I was researching the book on my father, because she wanted it a warts and all account. But I actually confronted her about the fact that she wasn't there for a mother, as a mother, that I was expected to be a grown up. And she dismissed me. She just said, but I needed you as my ally. They were her exact words. She wanted me as an ally and to help her with Anna and as an ally against Dad. So it's, yeah,
that's not
very interesting.
Those responsibilities should never fall on the shoulders of a child.
No. But I think a lot of us, I've been writing about the counterculture movement in this book that I'm writing. And I think, a lot of us, thousands of us went over to the India in the 1970s. Many of us, I'm not the only one. I have spoken to children that I went to school with, old school children. My story is not an isolated one. Look, some children had far worse home environments than me. Their parents might have been alcoholics, which thankfully Dad wasn't. But we all went off on this search to India, and this still applies today, that I don't believe you should be doing yoga, meditation, going off into spiritual searches until Jack Cornfield, who has this big center in America, mindful meditation, I think it's called Spirit Rock, he always teaches that we often try to escape our past by going off onto these spiritual searches, but we actually need to deal with those fundamental core issues first. And I think so many of us went to India with this psychological baggage and made things worse. We actually made things worse. We went from,
you go with the promise from others that it will fix those things. It's you're going with that information. You're going with the confirmation bias of other people that have come back from India and said, oh my goodness, you have to go to Pune. There's this enlightened being there and he's going to fix the world. So it's not you just deciding that going over to India or buying into these belief systems, not even buying into, but being attracted to those belief systems is going to help with those things. You don't manifest these things. You're told these things, you're taught these things, and you see them on the faces and in the body language and in the dialogue of those that come back from these places and tell you that they've had these experiences. And
we did have those experiences. That's what the hook was. Like, even when I went to Sai Baba, you listen, you do all these rituals and listen to this music and you do your meditation and you have these, not mystical, you have these incredible experiences. You feel fantastic. But it's the other thing that's the problem. It's the guru-disciple relationship that's the problem. If there wasn't a guru there, no problem at all. It's the teacher.
I have that
it's very interesting that the group, my generation, that was disillusioned with the counterculture movement and, very critical of my parents' generation. We rejected everything they stood for and their authoritarianism. We leapt into this, into India and gurus, and ended up in even more authoritarian relationships than those relationships that we had rejected, which is very ironic. We actually ended up in the most authoritarian relationship you can be in. It's probably partly still searching for a father too, and a father authority figure who's loving and kind.
But these places that are authoritarian and totalistic in the way that they are, which will go into in this next part, they are positioned as the opposite of that, again, to attract you in, to lure you in with the false promise of enlightenment and the answers to the questions that you have. You mentioned in your book never really feeling like you were at home, never really feeling like you belonged. You had some peace when you would go visit your mother's family, your mother's mother, which interestingly, they lived near Gloria Vale in New Zealand, which was something we talked about before we hit record. And everything always comes full circle with these conversations. But it still wasn't really satiating that longing that you had. So one day you go tell your parents that you're packing up your stuff and you're going off on your travels. So after this heady experience that you have in this darkened room where everyone takes their shoes off and you kind of take your shoes off and you're like, is this the right room? Is this like the flyers said it was here? And then you kind of go in the back room quietly, and then you end up in this altered state of consciousness where everybody around you is picking up their shoes and leaving at the end of the session, and you're still standing there kind of in this other place.
Yes.
And I don't know what the word would be for that experience, but when people say that they have a religious experience, they have they communicate with like God or Jesus, or they hear a calling for to become born again, whether it's Christianity or whether it's Hinduism or Buddhism. This is that experience that I have never had, and I don't even know. You can't describe it.
It's a drug. It's just like a drug, but you feel more in control, because I had experimented with drugs and had acid, and I think I say in the book it was like that, but I felt I was in control, and it was just ecstatic. Like, forget orgasms, forget sex, this is just absolute ecstasy, and I don't have to worry about men and sex anymore. I'm going to become enlightened. That was the huge revelation, that I am now on this spiritual path. I know where I'm going. I'm going to be enlightened. I'm not shackled and burdened by many possessions. And I was part of this, elite group. Like, why can't everyone else see it? And we had those altered state of consciousness often. And it wasn't, I don't believe it's not God. It's not God. It is just the mind.
It's chemistry, brain chemistry.
Yeah, I'm doing it even now with my cycling. I'm an avid cyclist, and I go out to get my little hit, to feel good in my brain. It's not quite the same, but I had never experienced anything like that in my entire life when I sat there on the floor of that ashram. It was so powerful, but I just wished I'd stayed there and not headed off to India.
Talk us through what that's like. You're planning for the trip, because this is a long time ago. I think if I wanted to travel to India now, it would be very much like I buy my tickets on my computer, I check in on my computer, I arrive at the airport, and I go through security, and then I get on my plane. I feel like it must have been very, very different decades ago to travel to a completely different continent.
Oh, I think it was easier back then. I think we just went to, what were they called? We would go, there was a place at university where we would just go and buy tickets. I can't remember the name of it. In many respects, it was easier. I was staying, I moved into this little ashram for a few months, went teaching for a few months, and was on a permanent high, and I only had a few possessions. I would have just bought my ticket, definitely not a return ticket, because I was not going to come back, and never thought of going with anyone else. I thought, I'm just going to fly over to God, to Sai Baba. It's like falling madly in love. Like, you're not rational. It's like falling madly in love, but magnified. It was just mind-blowing. It was easy. There was no depression in my life, nothing. It was just, and there were all these people around me. Some of them were thinking of heading off to India too. Some had come back. It was this is very exciting, heady time, and it was all very new.
So are you being told by people that have been over to India that it's a safe place, that you don't have to worry if you're traveling on your own? What are do you have reservations before you
No, none
head
at
over
all.
there?
Not in the slightest. No, not in the slightest. I just went out to the airport. Mum drove me out there. Couldn't wait to leave New Zealand. Just she wasn't worried. I've got photos of me that day. My God, I'm walking around in bare feet. Like, it's just astonishing in this weird white robe. And my face looks really happy and peaceful. And I've got this half-filled orange backpack on my back. And I just take off. And I think I first flew to, I'd have to go and check my book, into Madras. Many people talk about the culture shock when they arrive in India. I didn't. I arrived in India. I had long black hair. People thought I was actually an Indian. There were many times when I was in India that people thought I was an Indian. And I arrived in India and thought I'd come home. I thought, I must have been here in past lives. That's how I felt. It all seemed very familiar. It was not, I found the cities and the marketplaces pretty overwhelming, and it's worse today, the craziness and the bustle. But I loved it. I just flew into Madras and then found my way down to Puttaparthi, rented a shack somewhere, I think. No, it was and lived. It was just, I loved the simple way of living. And there I was in Puttaparthi with hundreds of other Westerners, devotees of Sai Baba, or maybe there were thousands and thousands of Indians, and waiting to see God. It was very easy for me just to take off, go to India. There was no culture shock whatsoever. I was so out of it. I didn't notice the poverty and the beggars on the street at first. I was just in a heady state, heading towards sitting at the feet of God.
So once you finally arrive at this ashram and you catch sight of Sai Baba and you do start worshipping at the feet of this person, what is that like for you? How does that feel? What do those sessions look like with Sai Baba?
Look, I was there for 3 months, and for the first month or so, our whole days were around these, what they would call darshans, where Sai Baba would come out twice a day. We would be sitting on the ground, thousands of people, and he would walk around slowly, and he would do this trick with his hand, producing this vibhuti ash, which was meant to be the sacred ash. We thought it was out of the palm of his hand. Later I found out it wasn't. It was just a sleight of hand. And invite a few people in for a private session. And I thought the first time I saw him, that he came out, I was convinced he was God. I was expecting him to come straight over to me and say, welcome. But, he ignored me and walked right past, and I thought, I can't believe this. I've given up everything, and he hasn't even looked at me. And this went on for several months, and I thought, and there was nothing else. That was all. I thought there's got to be more to a spiritual practice than just sitting on the ground waiting for Sai Baba to come out. And we were taught in that ashram that that's all you needed, was to be in the presence of God. You didn't have to do meditation or yoga or read scriptures. You just had to be in his presence. And I started to get quite disillusioned by it. And I started to get really pissed off by the talk of people. There was always this part of me, which probably saved my life, that was questioning and critical. I'd try and push that away and say that's my monkey mind. there was always a part of me thinking, what the hell am I doing here? And these people are all brainwashed and, whatever. And then I'd say, no, that's just my monkey mind. That's my lower self. But the breakthrough came, I actually had some very strong, powerful dreams. And in one of those dreams, I actually can't remember it. I haven't read my book for a while, but the dream was about Sai Baba. You might remember it better than me, molesting young boys. And I woke up in this cold sweat and was absolutely freaked out. I thought, is this my mind? Like, what's going on? And later that day, I went into town to this little coffee shop that was run by an American woman. And she looked at me and said, I'm surprised you're still here. Like, don't you? And this is the very first time I have encountered someone who's critical of Sai Baba. Up till then, we were just in this little bubble of everyone worshipping Sai Baba. She said, I thought you would have left by now. I don't remember his exact words. It was something about, he plays around with young boys, he's a predator. And it was like I woke up. It was like that part of me that had been questioning and doubting, I suddenly became a different person. It was like just in that instant, it was quite incredible. Like, 1 minute I was a believer, and there was no process. It was 1 minute I was a believer. I think some cult researchers that wrote a book called Snapping, they talk about this. It was like I'd snapped awake. It was like, what the hell? And I just literally took off back to the little hut I'd been renting and grabbed all my possessions and took off and thought, I haven't been with God. I've actually been with the devil. And I'm getting out. I'm getting out of Bangalore, Puttaparthi, as fast as I can. And I'm getting out of India altogether. And I saw a letter that I wrote to Margareta at the time. I wrote her a letter from Bangalore and said, I've been brainwashed. So I actually straight away had a clear insight into what was going on. And I was going to get up to Delhi and get out of India as quickly as I could. And I felt devastated. I thought, oh my God, what an absolute fool. There's no way I can go back to New Zealand. I'm so ashamed. My whole dream is just disintegrated. And so, I get my bag and buy a ticket and get onto a train to go up to Delhi. It was just quite, and I thought I was waiting for devotees to chase me, to try and talk me into coming back. And I thought, very occasionally on that long train trip, I had this, my mind is quite unstable, my monkey mind thinking, oh, have I made a mistake? But mostly I thought, I've just got to get away. I've been with the devil. I've made a huge mistake. And I don't even want to be enlightened anymore. I'm back down here on earth. And you would have read that story about being in the train.
Yeah, I was stressed reading that part of the book. It was stressful, like well, I don't want to say too much, but what happens on the train with your belongings, and then what happens on the train when you have the big woman standing over you, and there's just so, I was like, oh my goodness, get this person to safety.
Because I actually, by accident, and I won't even tell the listeners why, I threw my passport and all my money out the window by mistake. I'd actually hidden them in a paper bag full of raisins and nuts because I thought that would be a safe place. Nobody would look in the paper bag. They'd look in the backpack. And when I woke up, there were these big black ants biting me, and I saw them coming out of the paper bag. So I threw the bag out the window, and I actually had nothing. I had not 1 cent, no passport. And my first thought, this just shows how I was so unstable. I thought, oh, God wants me to stay. God wants me to stay in India. So so that's why I didn't escape India. I ended up going to Delhi, going to the New Zealand High Commission, who lent me money, and I ordered a new passport. But I was still planning to head over to Europe, hitchhike over there. I can't remember where I was planning to go, maybe Switzerland. And I thought, oh, while I'm waiting for my passport and everything, I might head up to Rishikesh, which was where I had originally planned to go, because that little ashram in Auckland was a branch of the Shivananda ashram. So I thought, oh, I might just go up to the foothills of the Himalayas and check out the Shivananda ashram and the Ganges. So that's how I ended up there.
I just couldn't believe it when that happened. I was, as I said, I was stressed.
What was that?
I was stressed. I was thinking, what do you do now? Because traveling back then or booking tickets to travel may have been easier, but I feel like losing your passport back then with no electronic kind of
no mobile
databases, being able to, to tell like, oh yeah, this person's a New Zealand citizen and we need to get her home, even though she's lost her papers. I feel like that you can do that now. If it's an emergency, I feel like there is a way that you can get home. But back then, what were they, like paper passports? Not even like, I'm stressed just thinking about it.
No, they're just ordinary passports. And then the New Zealand High Commissioner was absolutely fantastic.
He
they
was
had me over
your
there for
biggest
lunch.
ally.
And they were also very fascinated. They just thought, oh, what a fascinating person. What fascinating experiences you've had.
Through all the people that you met in this book and through all the difficulties that you had, this place, this house, and this family were like your saviors. I think they were like
The High
maybe
Commission.
the high commissioner. I think he might have actually been, at the end of all of this, the most enlightened of all the people that
I
you
never
ever
thought of that,
met.
because he actually helped me out more than once.
Yes, a few times. And I kept thinking, this is too good to be true. This person's going to end up having ties to like one of these ashrams that you're visiting. But no, just ended up being genuinely just a good person.
Yeah. There are good
So
people.
out of all the people you met, that man and his family were like, they were like the most spiritual, the most helpful, the most loving and
Absolutely.
caring. And they were just they weren't practicing any type of religion or spirituality. They were just like, yeah, come
Absolutely.
and have dinner with us. Here's some money.
Someone
So
actually said, oh, you went off to India to search for enlightened, and you sure did become enlightened. Like
gosh. So this next part of the timeline of your journey is the bulk of your book, the most significant part of your journey in terms of the Serpent Rising as a standalone piece. And we should probably just let the listeners know that there is some sensitive content to discuss in this particular part, and it might be triggering for some people to listen to. So do proceed with caution through this next part. But you've been with Sai Baba. There's no recognition there from him that you've found your place in the world that you're supposed to be. So you move on after this horrific dream, which interestingly enough includes all the very bold and I mean strange to the Western world with Christian iconography, but it includes a lot of the Hindu symbolism, because there's a lot of snakes and there's a lot of deities with multiple limbs, and you talk about this quite a lot in the book. Some of it can be quite frightening, and that played a part in that nightmare that you had. which was almost reinforced by the shopkeeper, the coffee shop, the next day. So you move on, you lose your passport, you decide to do a little trek up to the towards the Ganges and the Himalayan mountains, and you end up with a different enlightened or supposedly enlightened guru.
Oh, and don't forget that the High Commissioner gave me quite a lot of money. I don't even know whether I had to repay him. Like, how amazing is that? I didn't have one cent.
And you spent all this time escaping New Zealand to be treated the best from a New Zealander.
I'm still escaping New Zealand.
Can you just talk the listeners through your journey to this ashram and your first impressions of it? And then how do you settle in? What's the daily routine like, and all of that stuff that comes with finding yourself in a new place?
So I head up to Rishikesh, which I think's become the guru yoga center of India these days, but it wasn't back then. And it is an absolutely beautiful part, it was then, of India, just the mountains and the Ganges River. And I met an Australian, and I mean, I had given up on my search for gurus. I was just sightseeing. And I met this Australian, Martin, and he started raving about this yogi that he had been to visit up in the jungle. It was actually a little ashram across the river. There was no road there, right next to where the Beatles had gone to see Mahesh Yogi. It was right next to that ashram. And he was raving about this yogi. And I think at first I didn't want to know about it. And then I was curious. And I ended up, the ashram had visiting times in the afternoon for 2 hours. So I thought I would just go and check it out of curiosity. And it was quite an extraordinary experience. I talk about it in my book. I think my first impression when we were walking up there, I told Martin that the place looked like a prison because there was big fences and barbed wire all around. And, you know, he pointed out they have to keep the wild animals out, panthers, tigers, wild dogs. And he said, this isn't just like your typical noisy Indian ashram, like, because down with Sai Baba, it was quite noisy. There were thousands of people. This is a real ashram with a real yoga teacher. You know, they are advanced beings, he was telling me. And I sort of would roll my eyes. And he said, you can't compare them to anyone else. So, you know, I was very irritated by his talk and challenging him and what do you mean by enlightened and blah, 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 and, you know, told him about Sai Baba. So the visitor's gate is, you know, someone comes down to open up the gate and it's quite high. It's very remote. And I think I've got rubber, what do you call them? Sandals. And I go up to this ashram, absolutely beautiful place, very right in the jungle. There's no other buildings in sight. And I go into quite detail in the book about meeting the Swami Prembani for the first time. You know, we're outside and I hear this voice calling softly, come inside, Martin and friend. So I follow Martin inside this low-set concrete building with like a puja place, like an altar set at one end. And there was this young Swami in a bright orange robe sitting at one end. Behind him were all these candles and incense, and he's sitting there in a full lotus position. And I think he looked initially like he was just a child of 12 or 13, but when I got closer, I saw that he was probably, who knows, between 20 and 40. Beautiful looking, long black shiny hair. And I just sat down and he smiled at me, and there is this little interaction with Martin, which I won't go into, but then he looks at me and said, I think he had a go at Martin because Martin had been, getting caught up in drugs, and he sort of scolded him. And then he looks at me and said, you don't look as if you've played with drugs. Would you like to live here? Yeah, we have a 3-month introductory course, but most people don't last that long. They get dragged back into the ocean of the world. I think you're very tired of the world and of your life, are you not? I burst into tears. I could not stop crying. I felt a piercing pain in my heart. As this dreadful sorrow came over me, I cried and cried. So I'm just reading this little bit from a book. And once I glanced up and I could see he was just sitting there with his eyes closed, and I was sure I could see a shining light radiating from his forehead. But I buried my head in my hands and just wept uncontrollably. Oh, I feel quite sad for Mary back then at 23. Oh my goodness. And I just remember thinking, he is the most beautiful being I have ever laid eyes on. And then he looked at me and said, your problem is you have too much intellect. That's your problem in life. You think too much. Your thoughts leap here and there, create doubts, and destroy your faith in the divine. So straight away, it's, my problem. So I was completely entranced. I thought, yeah, this guy likes me. I've been acknowledged. I'm going here. There's only a few people living there. This is actually what I really had wanted to do. I wanted to go and live in an ashram and have a strict routine, not sit around on the dirt and the dust like I had at Bangalore with thousands of other people. And so I went off and he gave me a list of things to buy, the things that I will need for the yoga practice, long bandages to do all this weird Kriya yoga cleaning thing. And the next day I went up there to live. So I entered the world of he was known in the district as the boy yogi. So there were only three guys and 2 girls when I went up there. They were all Westerners. And it was a very, very strange, fascinating place. So, right to begin with, I thought, we had this very strict routine, getting up very early in the morning. There was no power then. There was no running water. Very, very, very basic, primitive way of living. Would have to walk down to the market to get supplies. There were some water tanks. And we had this very strict routine of getting up. I can't remember now what we used to do. There would be yoga exercises, meditating, prayers. A lot of our time was spent cleaning and doing household chores. We had very little food. We were allowed chai, milky tea in the morning. Our main meal was at lunchtime, sometimes nothing at night. It was a very strict routine, and for a few days it was, or maybe a few weeks, it was just extraordinary. And Swamiji would do meditation and give teachings, and it was, it's very similar to a lot of the small ashrams in India, just the whole Hindu trip and learning Vedic prayers and reading Bhagavad Gita, and it all felt very much like heaven. And a lot of the time we would go and sleep up on there were a few low set buildings. There was the main building where we would go and meditate. and there was a little room upstairs, which was Swamiji's room, and there was a building not far away from there, which had the kitchen and the bathrooms. We didn't have showers or anything. We just used buckets with water. And it was quite hot. We would often go and sleep on the roof of that other building. And one morning I woke up and there was an American woman there, Saraswati. And I looked out and I thought, what is Saraswati doing coming out of Swamiji's room? And I thought, what's going on here? And it was just, it was quite a shock. I thought, what's she doing? It's, like 4 or 5 a.m. And I go down, I think we had our, I had all these doubts. I'm thinking, my God, I'm wanting to be a celibate nun. I'm a celibate sadhu, we called them. We were all meant to be celibate. He's teaching celibacy. And I thought, what the hell's going on here? And during that morning, we were having our early morning satsang meeting, and Swamiji was talking about self-realization, and my monkey mind, my doubt was coming in, and I started challenging him, and I was being quite confrontational. And he looks at me and he said, an academic brain, you won't understand anything with that intellect of yours. First, you must learn not to question. When you accept me as your guru, like the others have here, then you will begin to understand. You have to earn the guru's knowledge through his grace. Learn to surrender. I know everything that goes on here, everything in your petty, grasping minds. These doubts of yours, you think I'm sleeping with the girls, don't you? And I'm thinking, oh my God, he can read my mind. Like, straight away I'm thinking, I just felt so ashamed. Like, how could I? And that's the trap. And I mean, and within weeks he'd called me into his bedroom to raise my kundalini.
It's infuriating because there are so many things that he has done in one sentence. Basically, like, turn off your critical thinking, don't question anything, listen to everything I say and nothing else, conform because everybody else has. Don't you, like, you'll only be able to have access to all of the things I have access to when you do what everybody else has done, which is only listen to me. And then calls you out for accusing him or thinking of accusing him of doing exactly what it is that he's doing.
I know. And that whole pattern in my childhood of being, blamed.
Yeah, and what a backhanded compliment. It's your intelligence. If you weren't so clever, you wouldn't even be in this predicament.
Yeah, so just and then I had that fatal day where one of the boys, we called them boys, Swamiji wants to see you in the downstairs bedroom. So there we go. And I think he said at the time, it wasn't even a shock. Like, he just said, and it was like, what was that word you used when I was talking about altered state of enlightenment? It was not good sex. It was bizarre. It was just, and he said afterwards, it's just like washing his teeth, but he was only doing it as a favor to heal us and to erase all the bad karma from sleeping with Western men. So he was doing this tantric type sex just in and out to heal us. And I just remembered, he said at the very end, dry yourself, just raising your kundalini, now go. And I walked out and thinking, oh my God, I just feel incredible. What's he done to me? I still don't know what he did. Like, did he slip me a drug under his tongue? I have no idea. I just walked out floating. So that was my initiation. And you weren't allowed to tell anyone about it. So the guys didn't know. Clearly he was sleeping with the other girls. Who knows? It was just such a toxic thing to go through. But I quickly became, very early on, he gave me a new name, which sort of fed my delusion of being spiritual. So he gave me the name Archana, which means adoration of the divine. So, I turned into another person very quickly, and quickly became his. We used to think Swamiji, he said he was enlightened, and we thought he was like Krishna, the Hindu god of love. And I deludedly imagined myself as Radha. I was his chief devotee very quickly, his special devotee. So for the first time in my life, I had someone actually, paying me attention, and I was special.
I've just remembered some wild part of your book. Saraswati, that's a name that's given from Swamiji, I'm assuming, to Saraswati, a new identity.
Yeah, so my name was Archana, and hers, that other American girl, it actually wasn't her name. Her name was Gianna. It doesn't matter because I've been in touch with her because she's still a devotee. I've already been in touch with her on Facebook.
Oh, goodness.
Confronting her for being a bystander all these decades. So it's Saraswati, Gianna. So Saraswati was considered the consort of the god Shiva. So, and we saw Swamiji as Lord Krishna, the god of love. And I thought I was Radha. Like, how deluded can you be? That little monkey mind of mine was always there, questioning things. I'd be floating along. I was had this divided mind, this part of me that just was devoted to Swamiji, surrendered to him, did whatever he said. But there was always this restless monkey mind, he would call it, occasionally having doubts, but I would push that down. That's, the negative part of me. And in many respects, well, where we were living was very beautiful, but we definitely were not malnourished. We did not have enough food. And so that also contributed to being trapped. But in other respects, it was just absolutely beautiful. Every day we would walk down to the Ganges River and have swims, and just the whole environment was just, we could hear the Ganges roaring in the distance. Just such a beautiful place. And I thought I would be there for the rest of my life.
It's tough to read about the closing of as Janja Lalich would say, the closing of the self-sealing system, where you are deprived of food, where you are deprived of communication with people on the outside, where you are becoming more and more where Swamiji is encouraging you to be more and more involved with him, but also not to talk about your involvement with him, with all of those people that you're living with and working with and cleaning the ashram with. And that there was this big emphasis from him to the other the boys, as you said they were called, about celibacy, and about how everybody should be celibate, and then had this weird explanation saying it's not sex, it's something else. And then he had a really good way of having a reason for doing things that was for your benefit, which obviously so clearly now was never for your benefit, was only ever for his. Like, when you come to see me, stop wearing underwear because it's holding you back from, you know, something on your spiritual journey, which is just...
we stopped wearing underwear altogether. It's very strange because I did have these doubts, and at one time I did leave. He gave me permission to leave, and I went off. I think, I used the excuse I needed to go and get my money and my passport. That's right. So there was this whole drama about my money and my passport, and it wasn't sent to Delhi, it was sent to Calcutta. And I ended up going off and must have met someone who told, we'd all heard about the Vipassana meditation retreats by Goenka. And I went off and did this 10-day meditation course with Goenka and thought it was fantastic. I think it was in, where was it? Bodh Gaya, this 10-day Vipassana meditation course where you sit. It's very, very popular in the West now. I think some people can be helped by it, but I think for other people, there are certain dangers in sitting down doing a long meditation course like that when you've had no prior meditation experience. But we would sit down 14 hours a day watching our breath. And I can't remember exactly now what happened, but I changed my mind about Swamiji, didn't I?
You
I
did.
thought I am going. He is. I suddenly started having doubts. So there was this Australian woman, Deborah, and she agreed to come back with me, and I was going to grab all my possessions and get the hell out of there. And I told Deborah what was going on the train. I told her everything. I said, this is what's going on. He's having sex with all the girls, blah, blah, blah. This is, he's the other thing that I haven't mentioned, that he was physically violent. He used to beat up the guys and beat up servants, and he would just, a bit like my father, he was very similar to my father. He would go from being this calm, peaceful yogi, and then he would flip into this rage, and he would call that his teaching nature. That wasn't his anger, that was his teaching nature, just to wake us up. That was Rudra. You've got Shiva in the god Shiva, and then Rudra was this violent thug, and we would rationalize it like, that's not being angry. He's got every right to be like that. It's their bad karma, that they're doing something that we don't understand, and we can't question him because he's the guru, he's enlightened, and he knows everything, and everything is our fault. He's beyond good and evil, and that's the whole danger I felt that was in the Hindu religion for Westerners, that we misunderstood that there was no God, no good and evil, and he was beyond it, and we couldn't question it. So he could be belting and with sticks, and we just thought they deserved it. It was their bad karma. So I'm on the train going back with this. I always kept meeting up with Australians, didn't I, on my little journey, going up to grab everything. So I go up to the ashram with Deborah, and Swamiji gave me, I got all my possessions and was ready to go. And I'm walking away with Deborah, and she said, I don't know what you're talking about. He's just absolutely wonderful. And she had told him what I told her. So I didn't know this at the time. And I just felt so betrayed. So I'm heading back down to Delhi with Deborah, and she's questioning me like, he's just the most beautiful being. I don't understand, what you were carrying on about, blah, blah, blah. So I go into, I'm in Old Delhi, trying to make preparations. I think I was thinking of heading over to Thailand or Burma. I was going to get out of India, and I was not ambivalent at all. There's no way I was going back to Swamiji. And I go out one morning. I haven't read my book for so long. I've actually forgotten a lot of this.
The interesting part about this section is that when you left Sai Baba, you were convinced that there were going to be disciples sent after you to take you back to the ashram, and that didn't happen. But what happens with this experience is that you are gang stalked. You do have disciples. Swamiji does send people to find you, to take you back.
Yeah. I go out to buy a lassi yogurt milk drink in the morning, and there's Angus in a taxi. And he said, Swamiji sent me to get you. And I was just blown away. I thought, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but it was like,
you're thinking, how did he even know where I was?
Exactly. I thought, it was like, here we go here. Oh, isn't that just incredible? I just thought he must be enlightened. I'm going to go back. So I go back. How could he have found me in the middle of Old Delhi? Like, it's quite mind-blowing. And it's really interesting that Rajneesh, that partner of hers, Vivek, who ended up committing suicide, she ran away from him. And it was so similar. He found someone to track her down. I don't understand that. That bit I simply do not understand. So I go back, and that night, that afternoon, I think he said, I'm going to give you what you've always wanted. I'm going to give you an enlightenment experience. And I go into great detail here because here it is, called All the Answers. I am absolutely convinced when I go back through this that Swamiji did not give me anything to drink. I think I had something to drink. No, I didn't. I had a glass, but I didn't drink from it. And no, he bought me a stainless steel glass of chai. I left it. It was still too hot to grip around the veranda. So I actually didn't touch it. This is the really weird thing. And I won't even go into it because it's just too bizarre, but it was like I had 10 acid trips. I just had the most extraordinary experience, and it wasn't negative. It was like, as he said, you're going to understand the truths behind this existence, the meaning of life and who I am. And it's just the most extraordinary experience, isn't it? Look, it was only a few years ago. I was living up in Mullaney on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, and I'd finished a bike ride, and I was putting my bike in the back of my car, and this woman came running up to me, and she said, "You're Mary Garden." She was an Australian girl that was in the ashram with me, one of the Australians. And I had made contact with her years before, but the few devotees that I tracked down were still making excuses from him. Some were still devoted. But she came running up to me and said, introduced herself and said, "You're right. He should be in jail." And we ended up meeting and having lunch. Luckily, she was one of the very few Western devotees that didn't have an abortion. But she said, we were all drugged. There was a guy that would come up from Goa and give Swamiji drugs. And that enlightenment experience trapped me in that ashram for years, and even after I'd left. And even people who have read the book, like, what, that is a real, genuine enlightenment experience. And I was so angry to hear that, because he said, no, I'm not sure what drugs he gave us, acid, whatever, psilocybin, and how dare he? So, I haven't mentioned that in the book because I didn't think for a second I'd been drugged, and I still don't know how I got it into my system somehow.
It's a pretty wild experience that you describe. And it was at this point that I started to seriously consider, that Swamiji might be responsible for the deaths of former disciples, because there's a section in your book where one of the disciples finds out that you and Swamiji are now having a sexual relationship, becomes very upset by it. Swamiji blames this person, says, this is your bad karma, this is your responsibility, you shouldn't feel this way. Monogamy is not a way that we should exist, and all of these really horrible excuses that all of these supposed enlightened beings always give in terms of polyamory and reasons why we should be happy to be polyamorous. And then it's not long after that that this person is found dead.
Yes, the bottom of Sydney Harbour. But they're since my book came out in the last few years, there have been some very disturbing things that have happened around Swamiji. There have been 2 unexplained deaths, and nothing's been done about it.
Oh, yes. So this next section really is the part that I think listeners might need to just listen to with discretion, I would say. So I'll just let you talk about this as much as you're comfortable with sharing with myself and the listeners, Mary.
Sure. And I need to add that this happened a lot in many ashrams in India at that time. You know, I traveled around for a year, and the same story I heard over and over again. So I started getting sick. Now, because of our diet and our lifestyle, my periods were very irregular, and I got sick, and Swamiji would not let me go and see a doctor. He said, it's just my karma, my body's cleaning itself. But eventually, after a few months, or more than a few months, I go down to Rishikesh and see a doctor, and she says, you're pregnant. And my reaction is very telling, because I leave the doctor thinking, oh, how incredible, you know, I'm going to have this divine baby, and, you know, I'll be like Swamiji's wife, and I've always wanted a child, I've always wanted to be a mother my whole life. And I felt ecstatic. I just thought, brilliant. And I go back to the ashram, and was just absolutely devastated. It was like Gyana or Saraswati. Gyana's the real name. I call her Saraswati in the book. She's locked herself in her little room, screaming and having a tantrum, and Swamiji's locked himself in his room. And within days, it becomes very clear that I have no option but to go and have an abortion. And Gyana tells me that this has happened to her, it's happened to others. She gives me the address of an old hospital, a hospital in Old Delhi. And I just thought, that's what I've got to do. You know, there's no way I could bring up a child. Like, I've got no money. I'm stuck in India. So I head off down to Delhi. And while I think I go and see the doctor, I can't remember the exact sequence of events. And I remember staying in this hotel feeling really torn, like there's a part of me, this is what I've always wanted, to have a child. And I go into a church to pray. And I'm just praying to everyone. I am praying to Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Shiva, like, help me, what am I to do? And I get up and someone has stolen my handbag. I have no passport again. I have no money. And that's a sign. So, I have no choice. And I rang the ashram, and no, before then I'd seen the doctor. So, I thought, I've got to go ahead with this procedure. The first procedure doesn't work because I am much more advanced than I thought I was. I must have rung Guyana because she turns up, and I think they went through several procedures, and then they said, we're going to have to induce you. And I had no idea what that meant. And I'd rung Guyana to bring, because I had no money, and she turns up. Only stays for a few seconds. She said, yeah, she's got to get back because Swamiji is in so much pain. He's in the most dreadful space because of my bad karma and what I've done to him, and he's just, poor Swamiji, blame Mary. So I'm alone in this hospital in Old Delhi. No one explains to me what's happening, and I'm actually 6 months pregnant. And I am alone. I feel a bit teary just talking about it. What the hell? And it was actually writing this section in the book. I thought, what the hell? That was the turning point. That I have been involved in something so dangerous. This writing this section of the book woke me up. And I am all night with this drip going down. I'm watching this drip sliding down. The most excruciating pain. Calling out for help, and these nurses, one nurse comes and actually ties my hands onto the bed and says, I can't remember what words he used, you old lazy slut, called me a slut. And I'm tied on the bed, no support, no help, and it was just unbearable. And I have this baby, and the nurses come in. No, they call me the slut after the baby. They come in, and this is quite terrible, isn't it? They chuck the baby in the bucket and says it's a boy, and I just was crying and weeping. I remember they took me back to my bed. The doctor was really, really lovely, though. I remember her coming to the bed and saying, that baby just didn't want to come out. And I didn't stay in the hospital. I just stole all these modest pads. I was bleeding quite heavily. I thought, I've got to get back to Swamiji. I've got to get back to the ashram. And I used all the money that Guyana had brought down for me to get a taxi back to the ashram. And was there any sympathy or care back there? Nothing. That was my bad karma. So that was the beginning of the end. And I haven't written about it in the book because I thought no one would believe me. But about 6 months later, I actually got pregnant again and had a second abortion. But I actually caught it very early, went down to Rishikesh, had the procedure. And, years later, I found most of the women who went to that ashram had multiple abortions. And it was all our karma. But in a way, that was the way that it was the beginning of the end, because I changed. There was a part of me, my whole life and the way I grew up in New Zealand was about suppressing our emotions. You're not allowed to be angry, and you're not allowed to even cry, just suppressing, and it was just intensified in India, pushed down these emotions, denial emotions. But I had this rage come up in me, and Swamiji was not paying me any attention. I was feeling rejected. I was feeling shamed for having the abortion. And one morning I completely lost it. We had these huge spears that we had there for chasing away wild animals if they got into the ashram. And they were all sitting meditating at the, down in that bottom room, eyes closed with the candles and incense. And I grabbed this spear. Good old, it was quite funny. And I charged into the room in front of all the guys were there. And I screamed at him and I said, you're a murderer. You're a murderer. You killed my baby. And here it is here. That's right. I was like a maniac, this long 7-foot spear. And what do I yell out to him? I yell out to him, you're a murderer, Swamiji. You killed my baby. You're a sex maniac. Oh my God, how brave was I? and I took off. I took off, and he actually told the guys, I could hear him screeching, say, go get her. She's gone too far this time. She needs a real lesson. And I thought I was going to be killed. So I ran over to the side of the ashram, and there was a little cottage, kutir, on the far side. And I rushed inside and slammed the door and just lay there. Nobody came. And I stayed there most of the day, crouched up in a fetal position, just thinking, what the hell, what is going on with me? And Swamiji came to the door towards sunset and whispered, has she gone yet? Because he had said earlier that I was, quite before this time when I, ran in with the spear, he said he felt that because I started being quite resistant and challenging, and he said, I'm being possessed by an evil spirit. He called it Ardana, that, there was this spirit possessing me. And so some demonic spirit was overcoming me. So he came to the door towards sunset and whispered, has she gone yet? And I said, I opened the door and had my head on his feet. I said, I can't take this much more. Please help me. And he patted me on the head. It's just your past catching up with you. Deep, deep samskaras from many past lives. Just have faith in Durga Devi, that's the goddess of destruction. They've got this pantheon of gods and goddesses in Hinduism. She will help you. And when he spoke like this, I felt relieved and expected that this phase of my life would soon pass. But months passed and Ardana persisted, and she grew in fury, and I spent most of the winter curled up in my sleeping bag in that far cottage, as Swamiji did not want me near him. So I was obviously very, very depressed. But I still did not lose my faith. I still thought it was me.
Section of your book is one of the hardest things I've ever read, and I can't imagine how lonely you must have felt and how much grief you must have felt going through that experience on your own, because you did lose a child.
I know. It's devastating. It's heartbreaking. I can't believe it was so cold that winter. I'm just in this sleeping bag. Sorry. It's quite amazing that I actually didn't become suicidal when I look back on it, but there's a part of me that's so resilient.
Like you're crazy with grief. Like you have nowhere to
No.
to put this feeling that you have. And we talked about this the other day. Like it's a subject that is so taboo in society that people don't talk about it. Yeah. And that is just in general. That's without this crazy psychopathic cult leader blaming you for being in this situation in the first place when you were coerced into having sex with him under the guise of your spiritual journey, your spiritual enlightenment for your purposes. And then you're expected to go through with this operation completely on your own in a foreign country surrounded by people that are shaming you and blaming you for this experience that you're having. And then you have nowhere to put this grief. You have this baby shown to you. You have this baby gendered to you. It's just so heartbreaking, Mary. It's really tough.
Sorry. I know. And then I do it again. I mean, what a bastard. And I have tried so hard to do something about this man because he is still alive. I've found it on Facebook. I've put posts up there that Saraswati Guyana is still enabling him. So many of us, a few others had late-term abortions. And the absolute horror of all of this, there were so many teachers, yoga teachers in India, the exact same thing was going on. So no wonder when I went to Rajneesh, where everything was out in the open, like what the hell, it was like going into a different country. So this guy is a psychopath. He should be in jail, but he's still there. He's still alive. Yoga Academy. It is absolutely, he's a criminal and he's a psychopath. And I've told him that. I have rung him on the phone once, years later. I rang him. I got the courage to ring him and told him, you're a psychopath. You've caused a trail of destruction and damage. You've destroyed people's lives. And it's bizarre that that didn't make me leave, but in fact, what really made me leave was Swamiji got another favourite disciple, which is just, and that was the end point when another young disciple from America walked up, and she became the favourite disciple. And that night I was going to burn down the ashram, and I ended up climbing over the back fence and taking off. So, but I did go back, but that's a whole other story. But the gift of the abortion, which sounds bizarre, was I got in touch with my rage, and my rage had been locked away all my life. Even though I thought the rage was my evil spirit, in some ways that was the thing that helped me.
I feel like maternal rage is like nothing that you've ever experienced until you have it. So maybe that's what it was. If it was a feeling that you'd never had before and you had after this moment. I spoke to a lawyer the other day called Carol Murchison. I'm not sure if you've heard of Carol, but she works with individuals who have experienced sexual abuse or sexual misconduct in spiritual and faith-based groups. And interestingly, when I first heard about that, I thought, oh, she's talking about like Christian groups, like Jehovah's Witnesses are being found to have covered up historical cases of child sexual abuse. But actually, she's working with a lot of people who have experienced in yoga communities and in Hindu communities sexual abuse through so-called celibate enlightened gurus. And it is rife. We've heard about these forced abortions with the stuff that's available about Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and the things that happened within his inner circle, all the way down to the disciples that would just come for a day and then leave and then come back again for a day. It's like an epidemic.
Isn't it now? Like, unbelievable. Just incredible. So the bizarre thing all through this is that I'd be writing, letters home to my parents. And luckily I've got copies of these because my half-sister kept them all, and I found them in a box in her garage when I went on a research tour to New Zealand in 2007 or 2005 for my book on my father. And I wished I'd had these letters when I'd written Serpent Rising, because I can't believe these letters that I wrote to my mother. And this is for the book that I'm writing, and I thought, I would never have believed that I was capable of such hogwash. I was so under a spell. And my mother was never worried about me. If either of my children wrote any letters like I did, I would jump on the first plane to rescue them and to kidnap them. And here I am writing letters to my mother, like, this is after the abortion, you know, beloved. And on the top, I've got sender on the envelope, Archana, Himalayan peaks, cerebrum of the earth. Like, what the hell? And beloved parents, brother Robert and sister Anna. This is after the abortion and after Swamiji had given me a very vicious beating, which I probably won't talk about today, but he and Guyana bashed me up one night. And I've got, you know, each moment of the day now is full of breathless joy as I feel Swamiji directing my each movement. I feel my heart opening. I mean, just pages of absolute rubbish. And then I've got, never will I need money again. Never do I need to think of returning to the world to earn money. Through surrendering, everything is provided, including peace and joy. And just absolute pages of absolute brainwashed garbage. And my parents, my mother would write back and talk about the weather in New Zealand. Like, what's going on with that? Like, incredible. And, you know, it's interesting because all these letters change. The letters that I write from Pune are nothing like these letters that I wrote when I was in Rajneesh. I was actually in 1,000 times better space when I end up in Pune with Rajneesh, even though, you know, he's turns out to be just as much a psychopath and dangerous, but it wasn't my experience.
When you jump over the back of this compound and you're like, that's it, I'm done, you do go back to New Zealand for a short amount of time?
Yes, I do. So I go back to New Zealand. So I've had 2 abortions. I've had this enormous abscess on my bottom, which is pierced in a Delhi hospital with no local anaesthetic, with this huge, huge hole in it, like 2 inches deep. You know, I'm suffering from malnutrition, and I end up in Auckland and I go down to see my parents, and I find out I've got hepatitis. So, you know, and I don't stay long with my parents. My mother was so caught up with my father then, with all his health problems, and I remember going to the doctor, our local doctor, and he was saying, you know, I was still doing my mantras and chanting and meditating, and I remember him saying, oh, well, I don't know what you're doing, but it's obviously been really good for you because you look so peaceful. You know, it's obviously very split off. But I ended up in Auckland, and I haven't given up on my search. I meet these Rajneesh sannyasins. So these sannyasins of, we didn't call them Osho. Oh, bright, orange, red. I met this bunch of people in Auckland, and they were nothing like disciples of other gurus. They really weren't. They weren't spaced out. Their feet were on the ground. And I started hanging out with them, doing the dynamic meditation. It was just incredible. I just thought they seemed very open, Rajneesh was really quite different from other groups at the time. And I like the fact that there was not this, because of all the denial with all these Hindu yoga teachers and not have sex, he was saying, just enjoy life, have sex, and you can express your emotions. And it was just incredible stuff. Like, this was so different to what I had, been experiencing in with Yogi Premvani. So I joined up. I actually dyed all my clothes orange, wrote to Rajneesh, got my mala in the mail, got a new name. These names really fed our delusions, didn't they? So my name was Prem, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Sagara, so Ocean of Love. And so, I turned orange just like that. I didn't go straight away. And for a while, I even took off my orange clothes. I went over to Australia and taught for a while, but was still very interested in Rajneesh's teachings. And then at the end of the year, I took off to India and Pune. So I think I was a Rajneesh sannyasin for well over probably 3 years, but 2 years in India. And look, it was the time when I went there, which was 1977, 77. It was a really good time to be in Pune if you were not in the inner circle. So Rajneesh had a compound then, which most of us didn't live in. So there was this inner circle living at Corrigan Park, and the rest of us, there were thousands of us, were living quite independently outside. We rented, some of us had like these straw huts, villages set up on the river and whatever. So we were quite independent. No one told us what to do. I think on the very first time that I had a darshan with Rajneesh, so I had 3 darshans, he told me, because you went in and you could book workshops. So at the Rajneesh ashram at the time, you could do Zen meditation, Vipassana meditation, Gestalt therapy. So the big difference with Rajneesh and all the other groups going on at the time is that they were offering personal growth therapies, which was quite revolutionary. Forget meditation, whatever. Had lots of therapists that had trained over in America at Esalen, but you could choose. So I went to see Rajneesh, and he said, do a few therapy groups, but don't do meditation. But I ignored him and went off. I went off and did a Zen meditation course, and I did a 10-day Vipassana course. So there was no coercion or control for me where I was. And I ended up doing some of these therapy groups. And for me at the time, with my childhood, what I'd been through and what I'd been through in Rishikesh, it was the best thing I could have done. Now, some of that therapy was very extreme. I would not put up with some of the things that I put up with, or, wouldn't condone some of the practices that went on. They weren't safe therapy spaces at all. There was physical violence in those groups. There were people insulting other people. But for me at the time, being able to externalize emotion and cry and scream and yell and get in touch with my rage, because when I got in touch with my anger at Rajneesh, I still thought that was an evil spirit. And I thought my depression was an evil spirit. But here in Pune, I just let it all out, and nobody abused me. I'd certainly witnessed certain people being abused, and I didn't do anything about it. I was a bystander. I feel quite ashamed about that. But it was so good for me. I can't tell you. It was just incredible. I deliberately did not do that encounter group with Tether because I knew I'd heard rumors about some of the things that were going on. That was the most extreme therapy group where there were rapes and there was a lot of physical violence and broken bones and stuff. I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. Some of the therapy groups I did were, you know, really gentle, really loving. Some were, you know, let it all out. And I think the next time I went to see Rajneesh, he said, oh, that's enough. I just want you to dance and sing and enjoy yourself. So some of the things he said to me were actually really spot on. The therapy helped me enormously. Look, it was extreme, over the top. But when you consider all the trauma I'd experienced and all the repression that I'd put up with my whole life, especially in my childhood growing up, and especially with Premvani, even doing Vipassana meditation, the worst thing I could have been doing at that time, I needed to be doing psychological healing. Even though that was extreme, it was absolutely fantastic. And I can see from the letters that I'm writing back from my mother, look, I'm back down there on earth. Even though I thought Rajneesh was Bhagwan and the God and there was all that worship going on, there's a complete change of personality, and it was a much healthier personality. And I was not aware. Look, I turned a blind eye to things. I had no idea of the sexual abuse that was going on with young women there. No idea. And I was absolutely horrified to hear that last year. But I was not aware of that, but I was aware. So I think towards the end of my stay there, I did start becoming quite disturbed with things that were going on. You know, there were the guards at the gate began to be armed because there'd been a few threats to Rajneesh. So there were all these guards at the gate with guns. I had heard of a few rapes. There was someone I had met who jumped off this Blue Diamond Hotel and killed himself. He'd actually just come down from Nepal. He'd done a 30-day meditation course. And there were a few Westerners who had breakdowns. This is the thing that disturbed me the most. There were Westerners who had breakdowns, had their malas removed, and were just sent off to mental health places in Pune and completely abandoned. And look, towards the end of the stay, I thought that there were too many things going on there that weren't right for me. And amazingly, like in one letter from my mother, she was going to come over and join me. She felt so excited about what I was experiencing. Then she sent me a newspaper clipping of the Jim Jones mass murder-suicide. And I remember reading that thinking, oh my God, this could happen here. I'm getting out. And I think that was the time when they were thinking of moving to Oregon. And I think Sheila, you know, I had several meetings with Sheila. And I think she told me, you need to go home, because I didn't have the money to contribute whatever. You need to go home. And I remember thinking, well, where's my home? And I did. I ended up just going back to Brisbane. I ended up landing back fully on earth in Brisbane. And I actually threw away my mala and took off my orange clothes when I was there in Pune. And during those last few weeks, I went and stayed at this Yapeksha lodge, and there was a Dutch psychologist there called Lynn Stevens, and we became really good friends. And she wrote a book, and she was the very first person to shine a light on what was really going on in Puna. Like, her book was published in look, I've got, where's the copy? It was 1980 or something. I mean, I wish that book had been published in English, because I recently got some bits translated, because she's got a photo of me in there and of her meeting with me and my ambivalence about Rajneesh. She was a therapist, and she went to those workshops and says, this stuff is totally unethical, what's happening here. So she wrote her memoir of her time in Puna, and that was, she was the real pioneer, and what a shame that book has not been translated. So I had given up on, it was like that whole snapping phenomena. I just sort of woke up and thought, I'm not going to be part of this group anymore, and ended up going back to Brisbane. And just remarkable how I just, I had no money, no friends, no job, and I landed back in Brisbane in a very nice part called West End, which was sort of very alternative. And I stayed in a Buddhist house for a while. But it wasn't too long before I met my husband, actually, my to-be husband, Kevin. And how lucky, I'm not with him now, like we're still on friendly terms, and I'm still involved with the family bike business. But I met Kevin, and there you go, I am pregnant, even though I had been told by a gynecologist up in Townsville that because of the late-term abortion and everything, that I would never be able to get pregnant. I got pregnant and had 2 children, and here I am sitting in Brisbane, a mum, and just had pushed all that whatever I'd gone through in India, I just sort of buried it. But interestingly, it was 1981, and it was a few months before my son was born. And I mean, I was lucky. I met a man who was a businessman, had this beautiful little house in Barden, Brisbane. I didn't have to work. He loved me. He thought I was very exotic. And very generous, the opposite to my father in that respect. I had all the money I wanted. And it was a few months before my son Eamon was born, and I was looking for something to do, and I saw this course advertised in town for I think it was 4-week short story writing course. So I trotted off to this, and I'd never written in my life, except at university. And I trotted off to this TAFE writing course, and I think it was very boring, but he gave us this homework assignment to write a short story. And I couldn't think, and it was meant to be fiction, I couldn't think of anything to write. So I thought, I'll write a story about my time on that train where I threw away my passport and money. And I called the story Ripped Off by Ants. And he came back and said, this is exceptionally well written. You need to write a full-length book of your experiences. You will find a ready market. And I thought, what the hell, really? Me write a book? So that was the beginning of Serpent Rising. I mean, I didn't, to have that sort of feedback was just, it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. So, by then I'm a mum, and I've got a son, and I love being a mother, and it was just a fantastic time. It was just the most beautiful time in Brisbane. But I knew I wasn't ready to write a book, but I'd scribble bits out, put it in a bottom drawer, and then I think it was about 1986, I thought, I have got to write this story down. It was just like that story was there waiting to be written. And I found the original book launch speech, and it was like 1988, and it's quite funny because it was I would be waking Kevin up in the middle of the night, reading bits out to him. I was so excited. I knew there was an incredible story there. But at first, bizarrely, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, I was quite ambivalent. There was even a part of me thinking, should I go back to India with my children? We might find my true guru. But it was only writing out my experiences, and it was, I had to do research, and there was no internet then. I was researching abortions and being induced, and I'm thinking, what the hell? I have been caught up with something quite evil. There was no ambivalence at all. And writing about that night that he and Guyana bashed me up and bashing the evil spirit out of Mary, Archana. So, I wrote this book. I was just completely easy to write. I was completely compelled to write it. And then when it was published, it was so daunting because I thought, there's no one else writing about this stuff. I had a lot of self-doubt. There's something wrong with me. And at that time, I knew no ex-devotee. I thought, am I the only person in the world who's been caught up? Sounds quite arrogant, but I knew no one. Am I the only one? So there was a part of me that still felt I must have failed. So I bring this book out into the world. I've still got a whole folder of letters that people handwrote to me, like from everywhere. Even though I self-published it, there was quite a bit of publicity. I was on national television, very nervous, really insecure. It was quite daunting to have my story out there and to get sometimes like quite negative, because Kevin and I moved up to Malani, and one of the community leaders said, oh, I had no idea why you had to write that book. So many people went to India and had fantastic experiences. So there was a part of me just overwhelmed with the publicity. And to tell you the truth, there was a part of me that felt ashamed of writing it. I knew that it had touched a lot of people, and people were writing to me, sharing their stories. I burnt most of that first print run and mulched it in the garden. And I thought, oh my God, what have I done? I felt ashamed for writing it. So isn't that incredible? That was 1988. And then 2003, someone said, you need to redo your book. This is all these stories are coming out. And now I'm just so proud of myself for writing that book. And it actually won an award 2 years ago, believe it or not, the High Country India Award. And I've just had hundreds of emails and letters from people. It's just had an enduring appeal, because I think when I first wrote it, I wasn't like an anti-cultist. I wrote it from a state of ambivalence. So I think the way I portray the main character and the mind control is actually really quite authentic, isn't it? It's just like, because I hadn't decided then that I'd been into anything bad. So it was just this whole story of what had happened in my mind, which was way, way more damaging than what happened. I mentioned that in the book. Way, way more damaging than what happened on the physical level to my body is the stuff, what happened in my mind, the mind control.
You spoke about there not really being access to therapy or the types of therapy that would be beneficial to people. And I just wanted to draw a quick parallel before we summarize and before we finish up today on some of the things that connect to your story. So you mentioned the Esalen Institute. We know that Charles Manson went there and was kicked out because he tried to kind of sell his ideas, and no one at the Esalen Institute in California was interested. But Bert Potter, also of Centerpoint, went to the Esalen Institute. He also went to the ashram in Pune to sit in
Yes.
on some of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's sessions, and he claimed to offer therapy. He claimed to offer what nobody else could offer. So I do see why you ended up, you know, at the doors of Bert Potter's commune looking for that support that he said he could give that nobody else could. And it goes round and round and round with all of these stories. And I just thought it was interesting that he goes and doesn't participate in anything in Pune, just observes, just watches, goes back to New Zealand, and then tells you that you're not welcome because you're a sannyasin and you've been
Yes.
allowed into Rajneesh's, you've been given this new name, you've been given your mala. But he took a lot of what he did at Centrepoint from that ashram itself. So I just thought that, isn't that
Oh,
so telling?
absolutely. Absolutely. Incredible name.
So now you've written 2 books. You're about to publish a third if you finish that
I've
first
just written the first
manuscript.
draft. This is a book that is being just as demanding to be written. It's quite bizarre because the Serpent Rising I wrote really, really quickly, just was like, and then the book of my father took me many years. It required a lot of historical research, tracking down archives. It was a huge effort. It spanned over 15 years. This book, I'm actually probing in. It's interesting because there's quite a bit I'm actually have written on my Turning East, is the chapter I called it, on the lure of the East for those of us who grew up in the 1950s and 60s and who were disillusioned by the counterculture. But I'm focusing more on, in this book, on sibling abuse. So even though I'm not in, it's being framed with my story of my sister, but it is actually quite a compassionate story. But I'm looking at the society that allowed this to happen and the sort of dysfunctional family that enables it. And sibling abuse is actually the most common form of violence in the family setting, and we are not talking about it. We talk about bullying in schools. We talk about intimate partner abuse. We talk about parental abuse of children. But when there's sibling abuse, we dismiss it as sibling rivalry. And it is a huge problem and has lifetime ramifications. So my sister there's been a whole history of abuse. We began to be estranged when I met my husband, 1980. I've had to go over to New Zealand a lot to help my mother and my aunt before they died. There have been instances of physical assault from her, and I intervened to save her life, the psychiatrist said, and my brother in 2007, and got her. She only got treatment when she was about 56. So 56 years, and was diagnosed with bipolar and schizoid affective disorder. Now, I'm only telling you this all now because, sorry, I'm going to cry now. I mean, she's caused me, mum and me, so much suffering. And I think it was because of that pattern with my sister that set me up into going to New Zealand. I only heard yesterday that she's actually dying and hasn't got much time to live. I'm not going to go over to New Zealand. And I thought I'd be really relieved and happy to hear that my sister was dying, but I actually feel quite devastated. I feel sorry for her. She's had a really, really challenging life, but she's caused me, just like Swamiji, quite a lot of trauma in my life, and mum. Very complex story. And I think it's time I shone a light on what the gurus were doing, and I'm shining a light on sibling abuse, because there are siblings who kill each other, and I spent quite a lot of my time, even as an adult, frightened that my sister might kill me, which sounds quite exaggerated and over the top, but it's the truth. So I've written this story, and the first draft was finished last week. I've had several people look at it, and I thought it is very much focused on, and this is what we have to do with cults, what sort of society allows this to happen? And that's the key question. It is still allowing it to happen in New Zealand. What is going on in the families? Like, has that much changed really since the 1950s? I mean, we're talking about these issues, but there are still these dynamics that go on in the family that leave people damaged, traumatized, looking for something better, or what's going on in society that people feel they need to join these groups and, you know, surrender their minds and intellects and bodies to these deluded psychopathic gurus. And I can't quite believe that so much of it is still going on today when there is so much information out there. That's just mind-boggling. But it just goes to show it's nothing to do with the intellect.
It's almost like, because there are so many people that went and there are so few testimonies as to what was really happening, people may think, oh, well, you know, I'll go over and see for myself what I really think. I wouldn't go over. I will never set foot in an ashram. I tell you that right now. People could tell me that they're the most magical places, that they fix all your problems. People could say, why don't we just go for research purposes? I would still say no. Someone said to me, do you want to go and get a personality test? A free personality test outside the building of Scientology in London. And I said, absolutely no way am I doing anything like that. Because I know I'm still susceptible.
We're
know
all
that.
Susceptible.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am not doing that because it is the abuse is still rife. The coercion is still happening. Swamiji is still alive and still has disciples and still has people by his side and has ex devotees that still haven't spoken out about their experiences. So
no, Guyana is still there supporting him. You know, there was a cult deprogrammer, Ted Patrick, who he used to kidnap people from cults till it was banned. He went into a cult in the 1970s to do what you were suggesting, and I think it was after 3 days he thought, I've got to get out of here because I'm going to be caught.
Yeah, no, I couldn't. It scares me even to think about it. And sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm going to infiltrate this group next week. What do you have anything that I should like? Does anyone have any questions I should ask?" And I'm like, just please don't do that. Why would you do that? I understand that there's like some attraction to danger thing going on, but just why would you put yourself in that position to even be? Oh,
I wouldn't go near. I don't go near. Look, I don't even do yoga anymore. I'm just allergic to yoga. I do, I go bushwalking, cycling. I just don't get caught. I don't like any groups. I don't even like cycling groups. I've actually got this aversion to groups and groupthink.
Organized activities. It's funny. It's like walking into the lion's den, isn't it? Or bashing the wasp's nest. Like, I am just not interested in that thrill-seeking danger behavior. That frightens me. People, stop trying to infiltrate cults, please.
Yes. and how also wonderful that my son and daughter have no interest. I think I've got these. How lucky to have come through all of that, to be in good health, no financial worries. I love cycling. I'm still working. And I have this son and daughter. My daughter ended up training to be a therapist in the family violence sector. She's not working there now. But how extraordinary that I've got these 2 children. And I wasn't the perfect mother, but I was way, way better than my mum. And I've got these children, and we seem to be, I don't believe anyone breaks the cycle, but we're breaking the cycle over here in this wonderful country of Australia. And my mother was so happy that I moved to Queensland She just said, it's been so good for you.
That's like the best ending you could hope for after this really difficult conversation, and getting to the end of your book as well, because it has all of the ingredients. It has the sad bits, it has the happy bits, it has the whoa, how did that happen mysterious bits, and it is so full of flavor in terms of the what you're experiencing in every sense, you know, what you can see, what you can smell, and it is so good at telling the reader exactly how you were slowly funneled in
Yeah.
to the point where you end up in that hospital room handcuffed or tied to that bed. It is like it explains it perfectly. There's no cult terminology in there. There's no let's look at the psychology or the science behind this, which I think in some memoirs and in some texts is really helpful, but it it you didn't need that with this book to understand exactly the tactics that Swamiji was using to get you into the place that you eventually ended up in. And of course, after you've been through these medical procedures and you're no longer of, in air quotes, any use to Swamiji, he basically just lets you start breaking down and you know, slowly dying in a room somewhere far away from him, because God forbid he has to look at you and you affect his karma. Oh my goodness. Oh gosh, this man. I hope he listens to this episode and hears me say what a horrible, wretched, little, small, tiny little man he is, and that I hope
We can
other
share
people
it on his
listening.
Facebook page.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, hi. I'm just so interested in your work that I've actually done an episode about it. You can listen to it here. And everybody that follows Swamiji, you should listen as well. This is really
There's a
important
very
stuff.
well-known yoga teacher that's actually endorsing him in one of his books. I just couldn't believe it. So I emailed him and I've got no response. He's actually
Yeah.
associated with the Jack Cornfield's Insight Meditation Center in California. And I emailed him too. And I thought, because Jack Cornfield wrote that wonderful thing about, you know, you need to do your therapy before your meditation. And he's endorsing this criminal who should be charged.
They all take influences from each other out of each other's little how to be a messiah handbooks, I think, don't they? Unfortunately. But that kind of leads us to the end of our conversation today. I really appreciate you sitting here with me. I know it's very early where you are. I know that there is a very tumultuous thing happening in your family at the moment. I appreciate you and your time and talking so openly about such vulnerable things, and for sending me so many copies of your books as well. I'm really excited to run the giveaway to send one of those copies to one of the lucky listeners of the show. And I am thrilled to hear that you're writing and that it's helping and that you feel like there is a calling for this book. I really hope that I get to hold a physical copy of the new manuscript whenever it's finished as well. And I just think it's important that we continue to highlight the dangerous practices of individuals that make themselves the objects of veneration, mortal human beings that put themselves in the position of enlightened, higher, special, otherworldly being, when at the end of the day, they are just exactly the same as the rest of us. They are just meat and flesh, and that is all that they are. And none of them are celibate. I would put money on none of them being celibate. And that's kind of just what I wanted to end on today, Mary. So please tell everybody where they can find you, where they can find your work, and where they can buy your book.
Well, I do have a website. Just Google me. You can find me on Google, marygarden.com.au. My book is available, should be there on Amazon, or email me direct. I think it's available as an ebook and a print book. I've just done a new cover because some people complained that I have got a photo of me with Rajneesh on the front cover and having a darshan with him, and there's so little of Rajneesh in the book. So I've actually just designed a new cover. So yes, so it's just been fantastic. I am so grateful that you invited me on today, and I think you're doing an incredibly important service.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'll be sure to put all the links in the episode description to your website, to both of your books, and then hopefully we can give the listeners an update in the next few months or next couple of years about a new Mary Garden book that is now available on Amazon or wherever you get your books. So thank you so much, Mary, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolute pleasure. You too. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this bonus episode. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I will also post links to Mary's work in the episode description. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.